The air inside the basement of the Library of Congress carried the weight of centuries. Dust particles floated in the pale beam of a single lamp, suspended like forgotten memories waiting to be disturbed. The year was 2019, and Dr. Eleanor Vance stood alone among rows of steel shelving that stretched into darkness, her fingers trembling slightly as she held a leather-bound ledger dated 1847. She had worked as a senior archivist for 17 years. She had catalogued thousands of documents, handled manuscripts that predated the Constitution, and never once questioned the official narrative of American history. But something in this particular ledger made her breath catch in her throat. The handwriting belonged to a government surveyor named Thomas Whitfield. His job had been simple: document the architectural measurements of federal buildings in Washington, D.C. for insurance purposes. What Eleanor found in those yellowed pages was anything but simple. Whitfield had recorded dimensions that made no sense. According to his meticulous notes, the original Capitol building possessed a heating system that required no fuel. The surveyor had written in cramped, urgent script, "The basement chambers contained copper conduits of unknown purpose. When I placed my hand upon them, I felt warmth despite no furnace being lit." The chief engineer refused to explain their function. Eleanor closed the ledger and looked around the empty basement. She had stumbled upon this document by accident while searching for mundane construction records. Now she understood why it had been misfiled, buried in a box labeled Agricultural Reports 1845 to 1850. Someone had hidden it on purpose. Her colleague Marcus Chen found her 3 hours later, still sitting on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by scattered papers. Marcus was 52 years old, a quiet man with silver-streaked hair who had spent his entire career in the archives. He carried 2 cups of coffee and wore an expression of mild concern. "Eleanor, the building closed 2 hours ago," he said softly. "Security called me. They said you wouldn't leave." She looked up at him with eyes that had changed. There was something new in them, a mixture of excitement and fear that Marcus had never seen in his methodical colleague. "Marcus, sit down. I need to show you something." He lowered himself onto a dusty crate, handing her one of the coffees. The warmth of the cup felt grounding against her cold fingers. "I found discrepancies," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not small ones. Fundamental contradictions in the construction records of Washington, D.C. Marcus sipped his coffee, waiting. He had learned long ago that Eleanor never exaggerated. According to official history, the major federal buildings were constructed between 1793 and 1867. But these survey documents tell a different story. The measurements don't match the construction timeline. Some of these buildings appear to have existed before they were supposedly built. Marcus set down his cup. "That's impossible." "I know. That's what I thought. But look at this." She handed him a photograph, brittle and sepia-toned. It showed the Smithsonian Castle in 1855, just 4 years after its official completion. But the photograph revealed something strange. The building's red sandstone was already weathered, eroded in patterns that would take decades to form naturally. "Stone doesn't age that fast," Marcus murmured. "No, it doesn't." They sat in silence for a long moment. Above them, the fluorescent lights hummed their eternal, indifferent song. Eleanor felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss of questions that had no safe answers. "There's more," she continued. "I cross-referenced Whitfield's surveys with the National Archives construction database. 17 buildings in Washington, D.C. have what I can only call architectural orphans, structural elements that appear in early photographs but aren't mentioned in any construction plans. Basement levels that don't exist according to blueprints. Ventilation systems that predate the technology supposedly used to build them." Marcus leaned forward. "Have you told anyone else about this?" "No, and I don't think I should." Not yet. He nodded slowly, understanding her caution. The archives were a place of carefully maintained narratives. Documents that contradicted accepted history had a way of disappearing, being reclassified, or simply never being found again. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Eleanor looked at the ledger in her hands. Thomas Whitfield had died in 1863, 16 years after writing these observations. His death certificate listed the cause as fever, but Eleanor had already found inconsistencies in that record too. The attending physician had never been licensed in the District of Columbia. The cemetery where Whitfield was supposedly buried had no record of his grave. "I'm going to find out what he discovered," she said, "and why someone wanted it forgotten." The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Eleanor looked up at them, feeling suddenly exposed in the vast underground chamber. For the first time in her career, she understood that the archives were not simply a repository of knowledge. They were a carefully curated version of the past, and she had just glimpsed the edges of what had been edited out. Marcus stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "Be careful, Eleanor. Some questions have teeth." She watched him walk away, his footsteps echoing in the silence, until they faded to nothing. Then she turned back to the scattered documents, alone with the dust and the secrets it contained. 3 days later, Eleanor received a letter at her home address. There was no return address, no postmark, and no signature. Inside was a single photograph and 4 words written in faded ink. "The archives remember everything." The photograph showed a building she didn't recognize, a massive structure with classical columns and a dome that dwarfed anything in modern Washington. The caption on the back read, "Grand Central Depot, before the reset, 1811. But Grand Central Terminal in New York wasn't built until 1871, and it had never looked like this. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table as the morning sun streamed through the windows, holding evidence of something that officially didn't exist. She thought about her career, her pension, her comfortable life built on the foundation of accepted truth. Then she thought about Thomas Whitfield, dead at 43, his observations buried for over a century and a half. She made her decision. The next morning, Eleanor Vance requested a leave of absence from the Library of Congress. She told her supervisor she needed time for personal matters. It wasn't entirely a lie. What could be more personal than discovering that everything you believed about history might be wrong? Her journey would take her from the marble halls of Washington to the forgotten corners of the American landscape, from crumbling archives in small-town libraries to conversations with scholars who had been silenced, discredited, or simply erased from academic discourse. She would encounter resistance, ridicule, and danger. She would lose friendships and gain enemies. She would question her sanity more than once, but she would also find others like herself, seekers of truth in a world built on carefully maintained illusions. And together, they would begin to uncover a story so vast, so deliberately hidden, that its revelation would shake the foundations of everything the modern world believed about its past. This is that story. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories like this make you question what you thought you knew, if the weight of hidden truth calls to something deep within you, then you belong here. Subscribe now and walk with us into the forgotten corridors of history. 6 weeks after her discovery in the Library of Congress, Eleanor Vance stood in the reading room of the Boston Athenaeum, surrounded by architectural drawings that shouldn't exist. The Athenaeum was one of the oldest independent libraries in America, a sanctuary of leather-bound knowledge housed in a building that itself seemed to belong to another age. Eleanor had come here following a trail of references she'd found in Whitfield's ledger, mentions of a master survey conducted in 1834 that had documented federal and civic buildings across the eastern seaboard. The official historical record contained no mention of this survey, But the Athenaeum's private collections, donated by Boston's oldest families, told a different story. Dr. Harold Pemberton met her at the entrance, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly from age. He had been the Athenaeum's chief librarian for 30 years before retiring, and when Eleanor had contacted him about her research, he had responded with an urgency that surprised her. "I've been waiting for someone like you," Harold said as he led her through the stacks. "Someone willing to look. Most scholars, they don't want to see. It's easier not to." "What did you find?" Eleanor asked. Harold paused at a heavy oak door, producing a key that looked older than he was. "In 1987, we received a donation from the estate of a shipping magnate named Cornelius Ashford. His family had been in Boston since before the Revolution. Among his papers were architectural surveys that didn't match anything in the official record. None. The door opened into a small, climate-controlled room. Harold switched on a series of lights that illuminated rows of flat files and shelving units. The air smelled of old paper and something else, something Eleanor couldn't quite identify. Cedar, perhaps, or sandalwood. The Ashford papers contained surveys of buildings that, according to conventional history, didn't exist in 1834, Harold continued. Massive structures with advanced heating systems, acoustic properties that modern architects still can't replicate, and construction techniques that supposedly weren't developed until decades later. He opened a flat file and carefully withdrew a large sheet of yellowed paper. Eleanor leaned in, her breath catching as she recognized the drafting style, identical to Thomas Whitfield's work in the Library of Congress. "This is a survey of Faneuil Hall," Harold said. "But look at the basement levels." Eleanor studied the drawing. According to the survey, Faneuil Hall in 1834 had possessed 3 underground levels, connected by a network of tunnels that extended to the waterfront. The lowest level contained what the surveyor had labeled resonance chambers, fitted with copper panels and quartz fixtures. "These chambers don't appear in any modern blueprint of the building," Eleanor said. "No, they don't. And when I tried to verify their existence through physical inspection, I was denied access to the basement. Permanently." Harold's voice carried the weight of decades of frustrated inquiry. Eleanor understood his pain. She had felt it herself in the weeks since her discovery, the maddening sense of brushing against truth, only to have it slip away. "There's something else," Harold said. He withdrew a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal a series of photographs. These were taken in 1889 by a private investigator named Samuel Reed. He was hired by a group of Boston businessmen who suspected that the city's official records had been falsified. The photographs showed buildings Eleanor recognized: the State House, Trinity Church, the old South Meeting House. But in each image, there were details that didn't match the structures as they existed today. Additional spires that had been removed, windows that had been bricked over, entire wings that had been demolished without any historical record of their existence. "Reed disappeared in 1891, Harold said quietly. "His office was destroyed in a fire that the authorities ruled accidental. These photographs were hidden in his sister's home in Providence. They weren't discovered until 1963, and by then, the buildings had been modified enough that no one could verify what he had documented." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the climate control. "Someone is systematically erasing evidence. Someone has been systematically erasing evidence for over a century," Harold corrected. "The question is why and who." They spent the next 4 hours examining the Ashford papers. Eleanor photographed every document, every survey, every anomalous detail. She filled 3 notebooks with observations and questions. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, she had accumulated more evidence of historical manipulation than she had found in 17 years at the Library of Congress. But it was the last document Harold showed her that changed everything. It was a letter, dated March 15th, 1842, written by a man named Ezra Thornton to his brother in London. Thornton had been a stonemason who worked on the restoration of several Boston landmarks after a series of fires in the 1830s. His letter described his growing unease about the work he was being asked to perform. "We are not building," Thornton had written. "We are covering. The structures beneath our scaffolds are older than any record admits." The foreman speaks of integration and continuity, but what he means is concealment. "Yesterday, I found a cornerstone dated 1634, 200 years before this building was supposedly constructed. When I showed it to the foreman, he had it destroyed within the hour. I'm told to forget what I've seen, but how can a man forget that his entire profession is built upon lies?" Eleanor read the letter 3 times. The handwriting was cramped, urgent, the work of a man who knew he was documenting something dangerous. "What happened to Ezra Thornton?" she asked. "He died 6 months after writing this letter," Harold replied. "Fell from scaffolding. The official report called it an accident." Of course it did. Eleanor left the Athenaeum as darkness settled over Boston. She walked through streets that suddenly seemed unfamiliar, looking at buildings that now appeared as palimpsests, layers of truth and concealment stacked upon each other like geological strata. Every cornice, every column, every weathered stone held secrets that official history had tried to bury. She thought about Thomas Whitfield in Washington and Ezra Thornton in Boston. She thought about Samuel Reed and his destroyed photographs. She thought about Harold Pemberton, spending 30 years in a library, knowing the truth but unable to prove it. There was a pattern here, a conspiracy that spanned centuries and continents. Someone, or some group, had been systematically reshaping the historical record, erasing evidence of a previous civilization so thoroughly that its very existence had become impossible to believe. But why? What could justify such an enormous undertaking? What truth was so dangerous that it required generations of dedicated suppression? Eleanor didn't have answers yet, but she was beginning to understand the shape of the question. As she walked back to her hotel, she noticed a man in a dark coat standing on the opposite corner watching her. When she looked directly at him, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time since beginning her investigation, Eleanor Vance understood that she was not merely uncovering secrets, she was disturbing them, and secrets, as Marcus had warned her, had teeth. That night, in her hotel room, Eleanor received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was male, elderly, and carried the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. "Dr. Vance," the voice said, "you have been asking questions in archives across the eastern seaboard. Questions about surveys, questions about buildings, questions about dates that do not match the official record." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "A friend, or at least someone who shares your curiosity. I have documents that would interest you, photographs that would confirm what you suspect, but I must warn you, once you see them, there is no going back. The truth is a door that only opens in one direction." "Where are you?" There was a pause. "Chicago. The Institute of Architectural History. Ask for the Moreland Collection. Tell them Dr. Harrison sent you." The line went dead. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hand. Chicago was 15 hours by car, 2 hours by plane. She could be there tomorrow. She thought about her comfortable life, her pension, her colleagues who would think she had lost her mind. She thought about the man in the dark coat watching her on the Boston Street corner. She thought about Thomas Whitfield and Ezra Thornton, dead men whose observations had been buried for over a century. Then she thought about the truth, waiting for her in a collection she had never heard of, in a city she had never visited, offered by a stranger she had never met. Eleanor Vance booked a flight to Chicago for the following morning. Whatever waited for her there, she would face it. Some questions, once asked, demanded answers. The Institute of Architectural History occupied a limestone building on the near north side of Chicago, its facade weathered by a century of lake-effect winters. Eleanor arrived on a grey November morning, the wind cutting through her coat as she climbed the steps to the entrance. The interior was hushed, reverent, filled with the particular silence of institutions that guard knowledge. A receptionist directed her to the third floor, where a woman named Dr. Catherine Frost waited in a cramped office overflowing with blueprints and bound journals. "Dr. Vance," Catherine said, rising to shake her hand. "Dr. Harrison said you would be coming, though I confess he was rather mysterious about your area of interest." "I'm researching discrepancies in 19th century construction records," Eleanor replied carefully, "specifically inconsistencies between official building dates and physical evidence." Catherine's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "The Moreland collection, then. I suspected as much." She led Eleanor down a corridor lined with photographs of American architecture, images that told the standard story of progress and development. But Eleanor now saw them differently. She noticed shadows in doorways that suggested additional structures. She spotted windows that had been bricked over, between one photograph and the next. She observed weathering patterns that contradicted the official ages of buildings. The archive room was cold, climate-controlled to preserve its contents. Catherine unlocked a series of cabinets and began withdrawing boxes, each labeled with dates spanning from 1801 to 1893. Edmund Moreland was an architect who worked in Chicago during its most dramatic period of growth, Catherine explained. He was also obsessive about documentation. He photographed everything he worked on, kept meticulous journals, and corresponded with colleagues across the country. "What makes his collection special?" Catherine hesitated. Moreland became convinced late in his career that the buildings he was designing were not original constructions, but modifications of structures that already existed. He spent the last 15 years of his life trying to prove it. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "And did he?" "That depends on what you consider proof." Catherine opened one of the boxes and withdrew a leather journal. "This is his final diary, written in 1893, the year of the World's Columbian Exposition. What he documents here has never been publicly released. The Institute acquired it in 1957 with the strict condition that it remain restricted." "Why are you showing it to me?" Catherine met her eyes. "Because Dr. Harrison vouched for you, and because some secrets are too heavy to carry alone." She left Eleanor alone with the collection, closing the door behind her with a soft click. For the next 8 hours, Eleanor Vance read Edmund Moreland's journal. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. Moreland had been hired to design several pavilions for the World's Columbian Exposition, the Great Chicago Fair of 1893, that celebrated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. The fair was famous for its White City, a neoclassical wonderland of plaster and steel that had been constructed in Jackson Park. But Moreland's journal told a different story. According to his observations, not all of the fair's buildings were new constructions. Several of the largest structures, including the Palace of Fine Arts and the Manufactures Building, had been built on foundations that predated the exposition by decades, possibly centuries. Moreland had discovered these foundations during the construction process and had been ordered to conceal them. The excavation crews unearthed walls of cut stone at a depth of 18 feet, Moreland had written. "The masonry was of a quality I have never seen in American construction." The blocks were fitted without mortar, yet no blade could be inserted between them. When I asked the foreman about their origin, he said only that they were previous construction and that I was to build over them. Eleanor turned the pages, her hands trembling slightly. Moreland had become obsessed with the hidden foundations. He had measured them, photographed them, and attempted to date them through geological analysis. His conclusions were staggering. The stones show weathering consistent with an age of several centuries, yet the style of construction matches no known period of American architecture. They appear to be the remnants of a massive structure, a complex of buildings covering an area larger than any city in the Americas. Whatever stood here before Chicago was not a village or a trading post. It was a metropolis. But Moreland had found something else, something that made the hidden foundation seem almost mundane by comparison. In the basement of what would become the Palace of Fine Arts, his workers had discovered a sealed chamber containing objects that defied explanation. There were copper cylinders filled with a crystalline substance that glowed faintly in darkness. There were glass spheres containing what appeared to be maps of the stars, but arranged in configurations that matched no known constellations. There were stone tablets inscribed with writing that Moreland could not identify, though he noted its similarity to characters he had seen in photographs of ancient Middle Eastern sites. "I have spent my life believing that I understood the history of this continent," Moreland wrote. "I believed that America was a young nation built upon a wild frontier, but what I have found beneath the fairgrounds suggests otherwise. There was a civilization here, a culture of tremendous sophistication that has been completely erased from our memory. The question that tortures me is not what happened to them, but who erased them, and why." Eleanor set down the journal and sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the archive window, Chicago spread beneath a gray sky, its towers and bridges and boulevards covering whatever secrets lay below. She thought about what Moreland had documented. An entire civilization hidden beneath one of America's greatest cities, its existence known only to those who had been sworn to silence. She thought about the world's Columbian Exposition, that celebration of American progress and achievement, built quite literally on the graves of a forgotten world. The last pages of Moreland's journal were the most disturbing. He had tried to go public with his findings. He had contacted newspapers, universities, and government officials. Every attempt had been blocked. "They know," he wrote in his final entry, dated November 3rd, 1893. "The men who control the exposition, the financiers, the politicians, they all know what lies beneath this city. They have known for generations. The fair itself is not a celebration of discovery, but an act of concealment. By building the White City over the ruins, they ensure that no one will ever dig deep enough to find the truth. I have been warned to stop my inquiries. I have been told that my career, my reputation, and my safety depend on my silence. But how can I remain silent when I have seen what lies beneath the world?" Edmund Moreland died 3 weeks after writing those words. The official cause was a heart attack, though he was only 52 and had been in excellent health. His journal was seized by the exposition's organizers and disappeared for 64 years, before surfacing at an estate auction in 1957. Eleanor closed the journal and sat back in her chair. The pattern she had glimpsed in Washington and Boston was becoming clearer. This was not random suppression or scattered manipulation. This was a systematic, coordinated effort to erase an entire chapter of human history, an effort that had been maintained for at least a century and possibly much longer. But who was behind it? And what truth was so dangerous that it justified such extraordinary measures? She gathered her notes and photographs, preparing to leave. As she reached for the door, she noticed a small envelope tucked into the final box of the Moreland collection. It was addressed simply to "The Next Seeker." Inside was a handwritten note on yellowed paper. "If you are reading this, you have found what Edmund found. You are not alone. There are others who know, others who search. Find us. We are waiting. Below the message was a symbol. A compass rose superimposed on what appeared to be a stylized sun, and beneath the symbol, a single name and address. Dr. Jonathan Blackwood, 1847, Harmony Lane, St. Louis, Missouri. Eleanor tucked the envelope into her coat pocket and stepped out into the corridor. Catherine Frost was waiting for her, her expression unreadable. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Catherine asked. "I found more questions than answers." "That's how it usually goes." Catherine walked her to the elevator, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. "Dr. Vance, I should tell you something. Dr. Harrison died 6 months ago. He had been working on a book about architectural anomalies in the Midwest. The manuscript was never found." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "How did he die?" "Car accident, single vehicle, late at night on a straight road. The police called it driver error." Catherine's voice was flat, controlled. "He was the 5th researcher in 10 years to die while investigating this subject. I keep track." They reached the elevator. Eleanor pressed the button, her mind racing. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "Why do you still guard this collection?" Catherine was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Because someone has to remember. Even if no one believes us, even if the truth never comes out, someone has to remember what was lost." The elevator doors opened. Eleanor stepped inside, then turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Catherine nodded once. "Be careful, Dr. Vance. The people who guard these secrets have been doing so for a very long time. They're very good at what they do." The doors closed, and Eleanor descended into the lobby, carrying with her the weight of a truth that had been buried for over a century. If this story is stirring something inside you, if you feel that pull of recognition, that sense that what you've always suspected might be true, then leave a comment saying, "The truth has been waiting for me." Let us know that you hear what history has been trying to tell us. Your voice matters. You are not alone. St. Louis in late November was a study in grey sky, grey river, grey stone buildings hunched against the cold wind that swept down from the plains. Eleanor Vance arrived by train, preferring the anonymity of public transportation to the scrutiny of airport security. Since Chicago, she had become acutely aware of being watched. The address from the Moreland collection led her to a neighborhood of Victorian homes in the city's central West End. Number 1847, Harmony Lane, was a 3-story brick house with a wraparound porch and windows that seemed to watch the street with knowing eyes. Dr. Jonathan Blackwood answered her knock personally. A tall man in his late 60s with white hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades asking difficult questions. "Dr. Vance," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I've been expecting you." The Institute called ahead. The interior of the house was a maze of books, maps, and photographs covering every available surface. Eleanor recognized some of the images immediately. Buildings she had seen in the Ashford papers, in Moreland's journal, in the hidden archives of the Library of Congress. Dr. Blackwood had been collecting evidence for far longer than she had. He led her to a study at the back of the house where a fire crackled in a stone hearth. 2 other people were already waiting, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and sharp eyes, and a younger man who couldn't have been more than 30, his face pale and drawn with fatigue. "Dr. Vance, allow me to introduce Dr. Sarah Chen, formerly of the Smithsonian Institution, and Mr. David Alcott, formerly of the National Archives." "Formerly?" Eleanor asked. "We were all formerly something," Sarah said, her voice carrying a trace of bitterness, "before we started asking questions that weren't supposed to be asked." Jonathan gestured for Eleanor to sit. "We call ourselves the Seekers. Not a terribly original name, but it serves. There are about 40 of us scattered across the country, working in silence, sharing information when it's safe to do so. Eleanor looked around the room, absorbing the magnitude of what was being revealed. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. "What have you discovered?" she asked. Jonathan walked to a large map pinned to the wall, covered in red markers and connecting lines. "We've identified over 300 architectural anomalies across the United States, buildings with construction dates that don't match their weathering patterns, foundations that predate official settlement by centuries, underground tunnel systems that connect major cities in ways that defy the official historical timeline." Sarah leaned forward. "But the physical evidence is only part of the story. We've also traced the organizations responsible for the cover-up. They've been operating under different names for over 200 years, surveying companies, historical societies, preservation committees, all of them funded by the same network of families." "The same families?" Eleanor asked. David spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but intense. "Old money, the kind that doesn't appear on Forbes lists. They've been managing the narrative since before the Civil War, maybe longer. Every time someone gets close to the truth, they intervene. Careers destroyed, evidence disappeared, sometimes worse." Eleanor thought about Dr. Harrison, dead in a car accident on a straight road. She thought about Edmund Morland, his heart stopping 3 weeks after he tried to go public. She thought about Thomas Whitfield and Ezra Thornton and all the others who had seen too much and paid the ultimate price. "Why?" she asked. "Why go to such lengths to hide this?" Jonathan sat down heavily, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "That's the question we've been asking for years, and we think we finally have an answer." He reached into a drawer and withdrew a leather folder, placing it on the table between them. "What I'm about to show you has never been seen outside this room. We acquired it 3 years ago from a source inside the Smithsonian. It cost him his career and nearly his life." Eleanor opened the folder. Inside was a single document, handwritten on parchment that appeared to be centuries old. The language was English, but archaic, the spelling and grammar of another era. "This is a directive," Jonathan explained, "dated 1816, issued by a committee that called itself the Council of Continuity. It outlines a plan to systematically replace the historical record of North America with a fabricated narrative." Eleanor read the document slowly, her blood running cold with each sentence. The structures of the previous age must be obscured, modified, or destroyed. Their purpose must never be understood by the common population. The technologies they employed must be suppressed until such time as they can be reintroduced under controlled circumstances. The memory of the old world must be erased so completely that its very existence becomes impossible to believe. She looked up at Jonathan. "The previous age, the old world, what are they referring to?" "Tartaria," Sarah said softly, "a civilization that existed before what we call recorded history. A culture that spanned continents, that possessed technologies we're only beginning to rediscover. They built the structures we've been finding, the buildings with impossible heating systems and acoustic properties and construction techniques that we still can't replicate." "What happened to them?" Eleanor asked. Jonathan's expression grew somber. "We don't know for certain. The records suggest some kind of catastrophe, a reset that wiped out most of their population and infrastructure. The survivors went underground, literally and figuratively. They became the guardians of knowledge that was deemed too dangerous for the masses. And they've been controlling the narrative ever since," David added, "deciding what we're allowed to know about our own past, keeping us ignorant of technologies that could transform human civilization." Eleanor sat in silence, processing the enormity of what she was hearing. Everything she had discovered over the past weeks, all the anomalies and inconsistencies and hidden archives, suddenly made sense as pieces of a much larger puzzle. "Why now?" she asked. "Why are you telling me this?" Jonathan exchanged glances with the others before answering. "Because the Council is losing control. The Internet has made it impossible to suppress information the way they used to. Independent researchers are finding evidence faster than it can be erased. The truth is coming out whether they want it to or not." "We need people like you," Sarah said. "People with credentials, with access, with the skills to document what we're finding in ways that can't be dismissed as conspiracy theory." Eleanor looked at the faces around her, tired, determined, haunted by the weight of what they knew. She thought about her comfortable life, her career, everything she would have to sacrifice to join them. Then she thought about Thomas Whitfield, writing his observations in a cramped hand, knowing they might never be read. She thought about Edmund Morland, dying with the truth locked in his heart. She thought about all the seekers who had come before her, reaching across time to pass the torch to the next generation. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Jonathan smiled for the first time since she had arrived. "Welcome to the Seekers, Dr. Vance." 6 months later, Eleanor stood in a tunnel 60 feet below the streets of Philadelphia, her flashlight beam cutting through darkness that had remained undisturbed for over a century. The Seekers had spent months planning this expedition. Their research had identified an entrance to one of the old tunnel systems, hidden in the basement of a building scheduled for demolition. They had a window of exactly 4 hours before construction crews would seal the site forever. Jonathan walked beside her, his breath visible in the cold underground air. Behind them came Sarah and David, each carrying equipment and documentation supplies. They moved in silence, aware that what they were about to find might change everything. The tunnel was extraordinary. Unlike the crude brick passages Eleanor had seen in other cities, this one was constructed of perfectly fitted stone blocks, its walls smooth and unblemished by age. At regular intervals, copper conduits ran along the ceiling, their purpose unknown, but their craftsmanship unmistakable. "This matches Whitfield's descriptions exactly," Eleanor whispered. "The copper conduits, the stone construction. He saw this same system under Washington." They walked for what felt like miles, passing through chambers and intersections that suggested a vast underground network. Finally, they reached a massive door of bronze and iron, its surface covered in symbols that matched those Eleanor had seen in Morland's journal. "This is it," Jonathan said. "The Central Archive. If our information is correct, this chamber contains the original records of the previous age. The truth that the Council has been hiding for 200 years. David produced a set of tools and began working on the ancient lock. The mechanism was complex, but not impossible, designed to be opened by those who understood its secrets. After 20 minutes of careful manipulation, something clicked, and the door swung inward on silent hinges. What they found inside would haunt Eleanor's dreams for the rest of her life. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow above their flashlight beams. Row upon row of shelving stretched into the darkness, filled with objects that defied immediate understanding. There were crystalline spheres containing swirling patterns of light. There were books bound in materials that weren't leather or cloth or anything Eleanor could identify. There were mechanical devices of brass and copper that seemed to pulse with dormant energy. But it was the walls that captured Eleanor's attention. They were covered in murals, painted in colors that remained vivid despite centuries of darkness. The images depicted cities of impossible beauty, towers that reached toward the clouds, bridges spanning distances that would challenge modern engineering, gardens and fountains and public spaces filled with people who looked both familiar and strange. "Tartaria," Sarah breathed. "This is what it looked like. This is what they erased." Eleanor walked slowly along the murals, documenting everything with her camera. She saw images of technology that seemed to blend the organic and the mechanical. Vehicles that moved without visible engines, buildings that appeared to generate their own light, devices that manipulated sound and energy in ways that modern science considered impossible. But she also saw images of destruction. The final panels depicted chaos, cities burning, structures collapsing, people fleeing towards ships and underground shelters. The sky in these images was wrong, filled with colors and shapes that suggested some kind of cosmic catastrophe. "The reset," Jonathan said quietly. "This is what happened. Some kind of cataclysm that destroyed their civilization. The survivors went underground, preserved what knowledge they could, and eventually emerged to rebuild." "But why hide it?" Eleanor asked. "Why not share this with the world?" Jonathan pointed to one of the final murals. It showed a council of figures in elaborate robes, gathered around a table covered in documents and devices. Above them was a symbol that Eleanor recognized. The compass rose superimposed on a stylized sun. They decided that humanity wasn't ready to know the truth, that the knowledge of what was lost and how it was lost would be too destabilizing. So they created a new narrative, a simpler story of gradual progress and development. And they maintained that narrative for generations, suppressing any evidence that contradicted it. Eleanor stared at the mural, her mind struggling to process the implications. Everything she had believed about history, about progress, about the nature of human civilization was a carefully constructed lie. The truth had been hidden beneath her feet all along, waiting to be rediscovered. "We need to document everything," she said finally. "Every shelf, every object, every image on these walls. This is the proof that will change everything." They worked through the remaining hours of their window, photographing and cataloging as much as they could. When they finally emerged into the Philadelphia dawn, exhausted but triumphant, Eleanor carried with her evidence that would shake the foundations of the modern world. 1 year after her discovery in the Library of Congress, Eleanor Vance stood before an audience of 300 people in a rented auditorium in Washington, D.C. The seats were filled with journalists, academics, independent researchers, and ordinary citizens who had heard whispers of what she had found. The past 12 months had been the most difficult of her life. She had lost her position at the Library of Congress. She had been denounced by former colleagues as a fraud and a conspiracy theorist. She had received threats, both subtle and direct, warning her to abandon her research. But she had also found allies she never expected. Scientists who privately confirmed that the technologies depicted in the underground murals were theoretically possible. Historians who admitted that the official narrative had always troubled them. Politicians who were tired of maintaining lies they had inherited from previous generations. Most importantly, she had found the Seekers, a network of dedicated individuals who had been working in isolation for decades, finally united by the evidence Eleanor had helped uncover. Jonathan Blackwood introduced her to the crowd, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to reveal. "What you are about to see will challenge everything you believe about the history of this continent and this world. We ask only that you approach it with open minds and honest hearts. The truth has been hidden for too long. It's time for it to emerge." Eleanor stepped to the podium, her heart pounding but her voice calm. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Vance. For 17 years, I served as an archivist at the Library of Congress, dedicated to preserving the historical record of the United States. 1 year ago, I discovered that the record I had devoted my career to protecting was incomplete, deliberately, systematically, and comprehensively incomplete." She pressed a button, and the first image appeared on the screen behind her. Thomas Whitfield's survey from 1847. "This is where my journey began." A surveyor named Thomas Whitfield documented anomalies in federal buildings that contradicted their official construction dates. He died 16 years after writing these observations, and his work was hidden for over a century and a half. She advanced through the presentation, showing the Ashford Papers, Morland's journal, the photographs from the underground archive. With each image, she felt the audience's skepticism transform into something else: shock, wonder, the dawning recognition that the world was not what they had been told. What you're seeing is evidence of a civilization that existed before recorded history, a culture that achieved technological sophistication we are only beginning to understand. They were called by many names in fragments of surviving records. One of those names was Tartaria. The room was silent, suspended between disbelief and revelation. This civilization was destroyed by a catastrophe we don't fully understand. The survivors made a choice to hide the truth, believing that humanity wasn't ready to know what had been lost. They created institutions to manage the narrative, suppress contradictory evidence, and maintain a simpler story of human progress. Eleanor paused, letting her words settle. But times have changed. We have the technology to verify evidence that previous generations couldn't examine. We have networks of communication that make suppression increasingly difficult. And we have a choice: to continue accepting the comfortable lies we've been told, or to face the difficult truth of who we really are and where we really came from. She advanced to the final image, the mural from the underground archive, depicting the cities of the lost civilization in all their impossible beauty. This is what was hidden from us. This is our true heritage. The question now is not whether this truth will emerge, but how we will respond when it does. The applause began slowly, scattered and uncertain, then built to a wave that filled the auditorium. Eleanor stood at the podium, tears streaming down her face, feeling the weight of centuries finally beginning to lift. After the presentation, she was surrounded by reporters and researchers, all demanding more information, more evidence, more answers. She answered what she could, directed them to resources the seekers had prepared, and promised that more revelations would follow. As the crowd finally began to thin, Jonathan found her standing alone near the exit, looking out at the Washington skyline. "You did it," he said. "The truth is finally out." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "This is just the beginning. The Council won't accept this without a fight. There will be attempts to discredit us, to suppress what we've revealed, to maintain the narrative they've protected for so long. I know, but they're fighting against time now. Too many people have seen the evidence. Too many questions have been asked. The old lies can't hold forever." Eleanor looked at the monuments and buildings of Washington, structures she now saw with entirely different eyes. Somewhere beneath her feet, the tunnels of the previous age still waited, filled with secrets yet to be uncovered. Somewhere in dusty archives and forgotten basements, more evidence remained hidden, waiting for the next generation of seekers to find it. "Thomas Whitfield started this," she said softly. "Ezra Thornton, Edmund Morland, all the others who saw the truth and tried to preserve it. We owe them this moment." Jonathan nodded. "And we owe it to everyone who comes after us. The children who will grow up knowing the real history of their world, the scientists who will finally understand technologies that have been suppressed for centuries, the ordinary people who will look at the monuments around them and see not symbols of progress, but echoes of a forgotten grandeur." Eleanor took a deep breath of the evening air. The sun was setting over the Potomac, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, she thought. Even a world built on lies could produce moments of genuine beauty, but a world built on truth could produce so much more. She turned back to Jonathan, her eyes bright with determination. "What's next?" He smiled. Everything. We have archives to unseal, researchers to coordinate, technologies to rediscover. The seekers have been working in shadow for decades. Now we work in the light. They walked out of the auditorium together into a world that was changing with every passing moment. The forbidden archives of Tartaria were forbidden no more. The truth that scholars had refused to show the world was finally emerging from the darkness. And Eleanor Vance, who had begun her journey as a keeper of comfortable lies, had become a guardian of uncomfortable truth. It was, she reflected, the most important work she had ever done. The search would continue. The revelations would multiply. The old narrative would crumble, brick by brick, replaced by a story far stranger and more magnificent than anything the Council had allowed humanity to believe. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. If you watched this far, it's because this story touched something real inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this journey moved you, if you felt the weight of hidden truth finally coming to light, then hit that like button and share this video with someone who deserves to know what you now know. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel. Here, we don't just tell stories. We remember what the world has tried to forget. We seek what has been hidden. We speak what has been silenced. The archives are open now. The search continues, and you are part of it. Until next time.